Hey everyone, tonight we are going back. We have got a Tuesday morning in 1963, and you are already behind before the coffee has finished percolating. The kind of behind that no amount of efficiency can fully correct, because the day was designed with more in it than any single person could reasonably be expected to manage. We have also got the story of Betty Crocker, a woman who was not exactly a woman, a name that somehow became one of the most trusted voices in the American kitchen for nearly a century, and the very strange, very human story of how that happened. Then we are spending some time behind the counter of a Woolworth's 5 and dime in a mid-sized American city sometime around 1961, because if you have never thought carefully about what it actually cost to stand on those floors for 8 hours and smile at the same time, tonight is the night we fix that. And finally, we're going to talk about what the magazine photographs of the post-war American kitchen were very deliberately not showing you. The gap between the gleaming harvest gold appliances and the wax paper smooth countertops, and the reality of what was actually happening to the women working inside those rooms, day after day, behind the closed back door of the perfect American domestic life. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here, and leave me a comment letting me know where you are watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up, and let us go back together. The alarm goes off at 6:15, but you have been awake since 5:53, lying there in that half-conscious state that is not rest and is not readiness, but is something in between, something that belongs specifically to mothers of school-aged children in 1963, a kind of pre-exhaustion that arrives before the day has technically started. The bedroom is cool, and the sheets smell faintly of the detergent you use, a clean, slightly floral smell that is somehow also the smell of obligation, because those sheets do not wash themselves, and they were not going to wash themselves next week either. You reach over and silence the clock before it wakes your husband. He has to be at the plant by 7:30, but he does not have to be conscious until 6:45, and those 30 minutes of quiet belong in some unspoken negotiation that has never once been discussed aloud to you. You sit up slowly. The floor is cold through your socks, even in May, because the hardwood near the window never quite holds heat the way the rest of the room does, and you have lived in this house for 9 years, and you still step on that cold spot every single morning with the same mild surprise. You pull your robe from the hook on the back of the door, the quilted one your mother gave you when your youngest was born, slightly frayed at one cuff now, deeply familiar, and you move down the hallway toward the kitchen because that is where everything begins. The kitchen in the early morning has a particular quality that belongs to no other hour of the day. It is the only time the room is entirely yours. The linoleum is cool underfoot. The curtains, yellow with small white flowers, are still doing their gentle work against the darkness outside, though the sky is already beginning to make up its mind toward pale blue. You fill the percolator with water from the tap and spoon in the Maxwell House from the can on the second shelf, the red can with the bright yellow lettering that has been sitting in roughly that spot since you moved in, and you set the whole thing on the burner and turn the knob with the practiced motion of someone who has done this approximately 3,000 times and has stopped thinking consciously about any step of it. While the coffee percolates, you go through the first round of morning arithmetic. 3 children, 3 different schools this fall, which means 3 different start times, which means the oldest leaves at 7:55 and needs a hot breakfast because she has gym first period and she gets lightheaded. The middle one leaves at 8:20 and would eat cereal every morning without complaint if you let him, but you will not let him, because you read something in The Good Housekeeping about growing boys and protein, and the youngest does not start until 8:45 and is, at this particular moment in history, your most complicated variable, because she is 6 years old and has opinions about eggs. Specifically, she does not like them when the yolk is broken. This is a constraint you work around every morning with the focus of someone diffusing something small but potentially volatile. The percolator begins to make its familiar sound, the gurgling, rhythmic push of hot water through grounds, and you breathe in the first threads of coffee smell entering the kitchen air. This is not nothing. This is in fact one of the reliable small pleasures of a morning that is otherwise structured entirely around what other people need. You take it in deliberately. You have learned to do this, to collect the small pleasant things before the household wakes up and requires your complete attention. You take a cup from the cabinet, one of the everyday cups, not the company china, and you pour carefully and stand at the counter drinking it while you review the mental list that has been assembling itself since approximately 5:53. It is Tuesday. Tuesday means ironing because Monday was laundry, and you have 5 dress shirts of your husband's, and 3 of your own blouses, and the children's things all hung on the line yesterday afternoon, brought in before the dew settled, and they are now draped over the backs of the dining room chairs in a state of organised not quite readiness that will need to be resolved before any of it is wearable. Tuesday also means that your mother-in-law calls sometime between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, and you need to be home for that, or at least available, or at minimum prepared with a reasonable sounding explanation for why you are not home, because she will ask. The ironing is not the whole of Tuesday. Tuesday is also groceries, because you did not get everything you needed on Saturday, and you're almost out of bread, and there is a pot roast on the menu for Thursday that requires things you do not have. The A&P is a 12-minute drive on a Tuesday morning when school buses are not blocking the intersection on Maple, and a 20-minute drive when they are. You make a note without writing it down, because you do not always write these things down. They simply accumulate in the part of your mind that never really rests, to leave by 9:30 if you want to get there before the produce is picked over. You hear the first sound from upstairs, a drawer opening and closing, which means the oldest is awake and dressing. You go to the bottom of the stairs and call up, quietly, because your husband is still sleeping, and because there is a particular octave at which you can make your voice carry upstairs without sounding like you're actually yelling. A skill you developed in this house gradually, through repetition, like most of what you know how to do now. She calls back that she's almost ready. You do not entirely believe this, but you accept it as a working approximation. You crack 4 eggs into the skillet. You do the youngest child's egg first, very carefully, because if the yolk breaks it will need to be started again, and you would rather not have that conversation at this hour. The yolk holds. You experience a brief private satisfaction about this that no adult in your life will ever hear about, because explaining it would take longer than the satisfaction is worth. You slide the egg onto the warming plate and cover it loosely with a piece of foil, then crack the remaining 3 into the pan together, where they can do what they like. The toast goes in. You have a pop-up toaster, a General Electric, chrome with a small crack in the handle that you have been meaning to mention to your husband for about 4 months, and it does its reliable work while you stir orange juice from the frozen can you set out on the counter last night to thaw. The juice is almost right, just slightly too cold still, which means it will be perfect by the time the children sit down if you pour it now and let it stand. This is the kind of knowledge that accumulates without anyone teaching you. You simply learn what the kitchen requires, over time, through attention. Your husband comes downstairs at 6:47, not 6:45, his hair damp from the bathroom, wearing the white shirt you pressed yesterday, which is satisfying to see, the proof of yesterday's work visible and in use. He pours his own coffee and stands at the counter reading the newspaper, and you do not resent this exactly, though you are aware that you are simultaneously managing 3 separate egg situations, keeping track of the toast, listening for sounds from upstairs that might indicate a problem, and calculating whether you have enough time to start the first load of ironing before you need to drive the oldest to school. He is reading the newspaper. These are simply different mornings, lived inside the same kitchen. The children come down in a loose sequence. Your oldest first, moving with the focused efficiency of a 13-year-old who has somewhere to be, and a social life that has begun to take on a weight and complexity that sometimes surprises you when you catch a glimpse of it. She eats quickly, drinks her juice, and leaves with the sound of the back door that you have learned to interpret as a goodbye even though she did not say it. Your middle child comes next, still in the slow, slightly hazy state that will not fully resolve until 10 in the morning, eating his eggs with the systematic lack of enthusiasm of a child who is compliant but not convinced. And your youngest arrives last, in the pink bathrobe with the rabbit ears that she will not stop wearing, even though it is May and too warm, and she looks at her egg and then at you with an expression of careful inspection that you have learned not to rush. The yolk is intact, she approves, you move on. By 7:45 your husband has left. By 8:30 the 2 older children have left. By 9 your youngest is at school and you are standing in the kitchen again, but this time it is different. The room has changed its quality. It is no longer the early morning kitchen that belongs to preparation and anticipation. It is the mid-morning kitchen, which belongs to work. You do the breakfast dishes first. This takes 11 minutes, not because you are slow, but because the skillet requires real attention, and the orange juice glasses need rinsing twice, or they get a cloudy residue that bothers you. You dry everything and put it away because leaving dishes on the rack is something you have a complicated relationship with. Your own mother always left them to air dry. You do not. This is not a moral position. It is simply a preference that has hardened over time into a habit that feels indistinguishable from a preference. The ironing board is already set up in the corner of the dining room from last week. You have learned not to put it away between sessions because taking it out and putting it away costs time that could be used on the shirts themselves. You heat the iron, the sunbeam, with the steam function that you bought with green stamps 3 years ago, and which has been, in a low-key way, one of the more satisfying purchases of your marriage, and you begin. Ironing is not mindless work, despite what people who have never done it seem to think. A dress shirt has a specific order of operations. Collar first, then cuffs, then sleeves, then back, then front. If you do it out of order, you create new wrinkles while eliminating old ones, and you end up doing the shirt twice, which is not an option when you have 5 of them to get through before your mother-in-law calls. You have ironed enough shirts by now that the sequence lives somewhere below the level of conscious thought, your hands knowing where to move and when to apply pressure and when to lift, but your mind can be somewhere else entirely, and usually is. You think, while you iron, about the grocery list. You think about the pot roast and whether you have enough carrots or whether you need to add them. You think about the conversation you had with your neighbour yesterday afternoon over the fence, about the new family that moved into the Reynolds house, how the woman seemed quiet but had an interesting face, and whether you should bring something over. A plate of cookies maybe, the oatmeal ones with raisins that travel well. You think about your youngest, about whether the teacher's comment at the spring conference about her being shy was something to worry about or simply accurate, and whether those are different things. You fold and hang each shirt with a practiced motion that happens while you're thinking about something else entirely, and by 9:45, 3 of the 5 are done and hanging on the doorframe, which is where they live between the ironing board and the closet. You stop and pour the second cup of coffee, the one you allow yourself mid-morning. It is still warm from the percolator, just barely, and you drink it standing at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard where the clothesline is empty today, a fact that feels like a small respite even though you know perfectly well that tomorrow it will be full again. There is a cardinal on the fence. You watch it for a moment without thinking about anything at all, which is rare enough at this hour to be worth noticing. Then you finish the ironing, remake the mental grocery list into an actual written one on the notepad by the phone, check that you have your pocketbook and your keys, back the car out of the drive, and go to the A&P. It is 9:52. You beat the buses by 8 minutes. The produce is fine, the bread is where it always is, second shelf on the left, far end. You are home by 11:15. The pot roast fixings are in the refrigerator. The kitchen smells of fresh bread that you did not bake and coffee that you did, and the ironed shirts are hanging in the closet, and your husband will wear one tomorrow and perhaps notice that it looks well pressed, or perhaps will not notice at all, which is fine. It is genuinely fine, because the work is done either way and there is still lunch to think about and the afternoon to move through, and your mother-in-law calls between 2 and 3 and the day is nowhere near finished yet. But for now, at 11:15 on a Tuesday in 1963, the kitchen is quiet and belongs to you, and the work is exactly halfway done, and the coffee in the percolator has 3 good cups left in it, and this, in the specific arithmetic of your particular life, constitutes something that functions very much like peace. The afternoon has its own architecture, distinct from the morning in ways that feel almost like moving from one room of the house into another. The morning is about getting things into motion, all those separate clockwork systems of children and husband and meals and laundry wound up and sent into the world. The afternoon is about maintaining what is already moving and cleaning up what has already happened and beginning the quiet preparations for what is about to happen next. It is in its way the harder half of the day, because the energy that carries you through the breakfast rush and the ironing and the grocery run has by now been substantially spent, and the afternoon asks you to keep going on what is left. You eat lunch alone on most days standing at the counter, not because you have no interest in sitting down, but because sitting down implies stopping, and stopping at 11:30 implies that you have finished and you have not finished. So sitting feels like a misrepresentation. You make a sandwich from the cold cuts in the refrigerator, the bologna with the yellow mustard that your youngest has declared she hates this week, but has liked for the previous 18 months, and you eat it while going through the refrigerator inventory to see what needs using before it goes off. There are 2 limp celery stalks that will be fine in a soup. There is half a container of cottage cheese that has about 1 day left in it. You note these things and file them into the menu plan that lives, like the grocery list and the morning schedule and the school calendar, in the part of your mind that never stops running its small, quiet operations. Your mother-in-law calls at 2:17. You're in the living room when the phone rings because you had the foresight, or perhaps the experience, to position yourself near it starting at 1:55. The call lasts 26 minutes. She wants to know if you have talked to your husband about coming for dinner on Sunday. You have talked to him about this. He has opinions. You navigate this carefully, because navigating it badly has consequences that last longer than the conversation itself, and you know this from experience, specific experiences you do not think about directly, but which live somewhere in your body as a kind of practiced caution. You end the call with Sunday still theoretically possible, which is the best available outcome. You put the phone back in its cradle and stand for a moment in the living room with your hand resting on it. Then you go back to the kitchen and begin making dinner. The pot roast is for Thursday, but Tuesday's dinner is its own project. You have pork chops from the butcher and potatoes that need to be peeled, and a green bean casserole that your family tolerates but does not love, which makes it ideal for nights when you're running on less than full capacity, because it requires almost nothing from you once it is in the oven. Just the can of soup and the can of green beans and the little crispy onions on top, and the oven does everything else. You peel the potatoes. The peeling has a rhythm to it, the knife moving in steady arcs, each potato emerging from its jacket in one long connected spiral if your concentration holds, which today it mostly does. By 3:15, when the school bus brings your youngest home, the pork chops are browning in the skillet and the potatoes are boiling and the casserole is in the oven, and the kitchen smells now like dinner, which is a smell that is as much about relief as it is about hunger, because dinner being in progress is evidence that the day is doing what it's supposed to be doing. Your youngest comes in through the back door still wearing her jacket, drops her school bag on the floor in the specific spot where it creates maximum obstacle for anyone trying to walk to the refrigerator, and begins telling you about her day with the unhurried completeness of a 6-year-old who's been waiting since lunchtime to tell someone all of it. You listen, you stir the potatoes, you ask the right questions in the right places, you learn that someone named Addie brought a kitten to school, and that her teacher, Mrs. Garrett, has a cold, and that there is a field trip coming up for which you will need to sign a permission slip, which means finding the permission slip, which means knowing where the school bag is, which means leaving the jacket and the bag exactly where they were dropped. You absorb all of this without writing any of it down, adding it to the accumulation in the part of your mind that keeps everything. The older two come home at staggered times, bringing with them homework and the particular energy of children who are no longer quite children, who have been out in the world all day, navigating things that are more complicated than you know, and who arrive home tired and sometimes prickly and always hungry, and who need, though they would not say this and might actively deny it, a kitchen that smells like dinner, and a person who knows their specific version of how the day went and asks about it in a way that does not feel like interrogation. Your husband comes home at 5:45, dinner is ready at 6, everyone eats. The conversation covers the day in the flattened way that family dinner conversation has, the surface of things, the anecdotes that travel, the small reports. Then the children are excused and you clear the table, because clearing the table at your house is your job, in the way that setting the table is the children's job, and fixing the back fence is your husband's job. And these arrangements exist not because anyone negotiated them explicitly, but because they solidified, over the course of years, into something that now feels less like custom and more like the natural order of things, which is how most customs work. You wash the dinner dishes. This takes longer than the breakfast dishes because there are more of them, and because the pork chop skillet has developed a layer of fond at the bottom that requires real persuasion to release. You dry them all and put them away. You wipe down the stove and the counter and the kitchen table. You hang the dish towel over the oven handle to dry. You turn off the kitchen light. The children are doing homework and bathing. Your husband is watching the news in the living room, and you sit down, at last, at the kitchen table in the near dark, with a cup of tea you made while doing the dishes, now just barely at the right temperature, and you're still for a moment in the way that you rarely get to be still. Not the sitting down at lunch kind of still, that is really just standing up thinking about something else, but genuinely still, your hands wrapped around the cup, the kitchen smelling of dinner and dish soap, the day behind you and the night beginning to do its quiet work. You're tired. You're specifically granularly tired. Tired in your feet and your shoulders and in the part of your mind that has been managing variables since 5:53 this morning. But there is also something else here. Something that does not have a clean name, but that exists in the specific satisfaction of a day that required a great deal and got it. The shirts are ironed, the groceries are home, the pot roast has its carrots. Your youngest ate dinner including the green beans, which she usually picks around. Your middle child mentioned something in passing about a test he feels good about. Your oldest walked in the door without the particular expression she has been wearing lately, the one you cannot quite interpret, and said dinner smelled good, which is not nothing. The tea is warm, the house is settling into its evening sounds, and for now, in this kitchen that you have run since 1954 with the focused, invisible competence of someone who has learned to do this well, without anyone thinking to tell them they are doing it well, this is enough. This is, in every way that actually counts, exactly enough. There is something that no magazine photograph of a 1963 kitchen ever managed to capture, and it is not a visual thing, which may be why photography could not catch it. It is the quality of the attention, the continuous, ambient, never quite switched off attention that running a household of 5 people requires, the kind of attention that processes information constantly, that reads the difference between the sound a child makes when they are fine and the sound they make when they are getting sick, that notices the milk is lower than it should be for a Tuesday and adjusts the shopping list accordingly without ever sitting down to think explicitly about adjusting the shopping list, that keeps track of which child has a permission slip due and which one has a dental appointment next week, and whether the dentist appointment conflicts with the afternoon when the car is going to be in the shop for the brake job that has been deferred since March. This attention is not effortless. The word effortless is the word that the culture of the era used about things it did not want to look at directly. What it actually is practiced. It is the result of years of doing this particular thing in this particular household, learning its specific rhythms and variables and pressure points, developing the responses until they feel automatic, until the tracking and the planning and the managing all run in some part of the mind that is not quite the conscious part, leaving the conscious part free for whatever the current moment requires. This looks from the outside like competence. From the inside, it feels most of the time like Thursday. Wednesday in a 1963 household has a different weight than Tuesday. Tuesday, as we've seen, belongs to ironing and groceries and the particular rhythm of midweek maintenance. Wednesday belongs to something slightly more forward-facing, the planning and preparation that keeps Thursday and Friday from becoming crises. Wednesday is when you think about the weekend, which sounds restful and is not, because the weekend means your husband is home, which changes the meal requirements and the household dynamic and the level of activity in ways that require their own anticipation. Weekend cooking is different from weekday cooking, more elaborate, more social, more susceptible to the judgment of someone who has opinions about how things taste, without necessarily having spent the week doing the work that produces things that taste good. You stand at the kitchen table on Wednesday morning with the week's menu written on the small notepad, and you look at what Thursday and Friday need. Thursday is the pot roast, which you have already sorted. The carrots are in the refrigerator, and the roast itself has been thawed since Tuesday night. The pot roast will go in at 10 in the morning and will be ready by 6, which is dinner time, and the house will smell the way houses smell when something has been cooking slowly for 8 hours, a smell that produces a particular effect on people who have been out in the world all day and come home to it, a kind of physical unwinding that happens before they have even put their coat away. You have noticed this effect and you produce it deliberately, not as performance but as something you understand to be genuinely useful, one of the invisible contributions of the kitchen that the people benefiting from it rarely think about until they encounter a day when it is absent. Friday's more open. Friday could be the fish cakes that your husband prefers, or it could be the chicken that is in the freezer and needs to be used, or it could be something entirely different depending on what looks good at the market when you stop in Thursday afternoon for bread. You make a note that Friday is flexible, which is its own kind of decision, the decision to leave a variable open and trust your own judgment when the time comes, which is something you have learned to do through years of experience, but which still requires a deliberate choice not to overplan, not to close every variable in advance, because overplanning in a household this size produces its own kind of rigidity, and rigidity produces waste. The marketing, which is what you call the grocery shopping in the way that your mother called it and her mother called it, a word that has been falling out of use in this decade and will be largely gone by the next one, requires a particular kind of preparation that is not simply making a list. Making the list is the obvious part. The part underneath the list is the inventory, the quiet ongoing audit of what is in the refrigerator and the pantry and the freezer, what has been used and what needs replacing and what is about to turn and what is already gone. You do not write this inventory down. It exists in your head in the form of what you know is there and what you know is missing, updated automatically each time you open the refrigerator door or reach for something on the pantry shelf. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. This mental inventory is not a natural gift, not something you were born with. It is a skill, built through practice and through the specific consequence of running out of things, at moments when running out of things is not acceptable, which is essentially any weekday evening when 5 people are expecting dinner. The chicken stock is low. You note this without ceremony because noting it is enough. The note will translate automatically into action at the right moment, which is when you have a carcass from the next chicken you cook, which will be either this Friday or early the following week depending on the Friday decision, and then the carcass will go in the pot with the celery and the onion and the peppercorns and simmer for the better part of an afternoon, filling the kitchen with a smell that is among the oldest and most specifically domestic smells in human experience. The smell of stock. The smell of something being slowly extracted from bones for the benefit of future meals. You have been making stock in this kitchen since 1954. The knowledge of how to do it lives in your body in the way that things do when you have done them enough times that thinking about them is no longer required. There is a woman on your street, your neighbour 2 houses down, whose name is Patricia, who does not make her own stock. You know this because she told you without embarrassment, and because you have seen the cans of Campbell's in her shopping cart at the A&P. You do not judge Patricia for this. Patricia works part-time at the school district office and has 3 children and a husband who travels for work, which means she's running her household essentially alone 4 days out of 7, and the calculation she has made about her time and her stock is a reasonable calculation. But you also know, and this is not a moral position, simply a practical one, that the soups and the stews and the sauces in your kitchen taste different than they would if you made them with the canned stock, and that the difference is real and noticeable to anyone paying attention, and that the attention required to produce that difference is part of the invisible accounting of this kitchen. The cleaning rotation in a house this size does not happen spontaneously. It happens because someone is tracking it and executing it on a schedule that does not always feel convenient, but that reflects an understanding that a house left to clean itself will not clean itself, and that the gap between a house that is cleaned regularly and a house that is cleaned reactively is a gap that becomes visible in ways that are difficult to recover from. The bathroom upstairs needs real attention every 4 days, not because it gets catastrophically dirty in 4 days, but because the alternative to cleaning it at 4 days is cleaning it at a week, and at a week the tub has a ring, and the sink has a film, and the floor around the toilet has acquired a character that requires more than a quick wipe to address. You have a cleaning schedule that no one in your household is aware of because the schedule produces results that are invisible, precisely because they are maintained, and invisible results do not prompt acknowledgement, which is one of the interesting properties of household management, that its successes are measured by the absence of problems rather than by the presence of accomplishments. Thursdays have a particular quality that you have come to associate with the smell of the pot roast, and a kind of midweek arrival, the sense that the week has reached its heaviest point and begun to move toward the other side. By Thursday morning you know how the week is going, which children are struggling with something and which are fine, what is happening with the household finances relative to where they should be at this point in the month, whether the weekend will require special management or can be allowed to unfold without close attention. Thursday morning is when all the tracking of the first half of the week produces a picture, and the picture informs the management of the second half. You put the pot roast in at 10 o'clock on Thursday, setting it in the heavy cast iron Dutch oven with the onions and the carrots and the beef broth and the bay leaf, covering it and putting it in the oven at 325 degrees, which is the temperature at which this particular roast, in this particular pot, in this particular oven, produces the result you want after 8 hours. You know this not from the recipe, though the recipe says something similar, but from the 14 times you have made this pot roast in this oven with this pot, and adjusted until you found the specific combination that works. Cooking at this level of familiarity is not following instructions. It is the application of accumulated knowledge about the specific behaviour of specific equipment and specific ingredients in specific conditions, and it looks, from the outside, like routine, which it is, but it is a routine built on a foundation of real understanding that is easy to overlook because routines that work well look effortless. The afternoon on Thursday has a different rhythm than other afternoons because dinner is not requiring active management after 10 in the morning, which frees the afternoon for the other things. Mending, which accumulates in the sewing basket in the corner of the bedroom in a way that is always slightly alarming when you finally address it. The permission slip that needed to go back to school, and which you finally found in the bottom of the school bag on Tuesday, and which has been sitting on the kitchen counter waiting to be signed and returned. The thank you note that you owe your sister-in-law for the birthday present she sent the youngest, a note that has been overdue for 2 weeks and that grows heavier in the mental accounting with every day it remains unsent. These tasks exist in the margins of the week, in the spaces between the primary obligations, and they require a particular kind of attention to manage, not the sustained focus that the cooking and the ironing require, but the willingness to move between small things without losing track of any of them. The smell of the pot roast reaches the back of the house by 2 in the afternoon, rich and deep and unmistakably the smell of a meal that has been cooking slowly and patiently all day, and when your youngest comes home from school at 3:15 and pushes through the back door and smells it, her face does something specific that you have been watching for years, a brief involuntary pleasure that is also a kind of recognition. The smell of dinner on a Thursday, the smell of this particular Thursday in this particular house, which is her particular house, and which will be the house she carries in her body for the rest of her life, even after she has left it and built something else elsewhere. You do not think about this explicitly when you watch her face do that thing, but you are aware of it in some way that does not require thought to register. Friday arrives with the specific quality of Fridays, a loosening, a slight forward lean toward the weekend that even the children feel, even the youngest who cannot quite articulate why Friday feels different from Tuesday, but for whom it unmistakably does. You made the chicken decision, in the end, on Thursday afternoon when you assessed the refrigerator and the freezer and the general state of everyone's appetite for something heavy versus something lighter, and the chicken won, not from the freezer but from the butcher because Friday felt like it wanted something that had not been planned since Wednesday, something decided today, which is a kind of domestic spontaneity that is real even if it looks small from the outside. The weekend brings your husband home in the full-day sense rather than the evening sense, which changes the household dynamic in ways that are not simple, and not simple to describe. He is not a difficult man. He is a man of his time and place, which means he occupies the house with an ease that is built on not having to think consciously about the systems that keep it running, and he carries with him from his week a weight of professional preoccupation that takes time to set down. By Saturday afternoon he has set it down and become more fully present, and the household is different then, warmer in a particular way, more complete. The children move differently around him than they do around you, because his presence in the house on a weekday has a slightly formal quality that his presence on a Saturday does not, and the Saturday version of him is the one they will remember when they are grown and trying to remember their father. Sunday ends the week in the particular way that Sundays always end it, with the awareness of Monday already present underneath everything, the meal planning resuming in the back of the mind, the week's variables beginning to assemble themselves into the familiar shape of another round. You do the Sunday dinner dishes at 8 in the evening and hang the dish towel over the oven handle and turn off the kitchen light, and Monday is already beginning somewhere in the part of your mind that never quite rests, already building the list, already tracking the variables, already doing the invisible work that will produce, by morning, a kitchen ready to begin again. The smell of the 1963 kitchen on a specific morning in May has a particular quality that is worth trying to reconstruct precisely, because smell is the sense most connected to memory and most resistant to the flattening that time performs on other kinds of detail. The gas burner catching, a quick sulphurous snap before the blue flame settles into its steady ring. The coffee in the percolator, not the first faint suggestion but the full presence of it. The way it fills the kitchen air and begins to bleed into the hallway before the rest of the house has woken up. The bread, if there is bread from yesterday still in the bread box on the counter, the specific smell of good bread slightly past its freshest morning, Still fine but softening, requiring toasting to be what it should be. Underneath all of it, the base note of a kitchen that is lived in, that has been lived in for 9 years, a composite smell that is not any single ingredient but the accumulation of all of them, the rendered fats and the baked flour and the washed surfaces and the specific water of a specific household, a smell that is, for the people inside it, simply home, which is the word that covers the entire experience without explaining any of it. The toast comes out of the General Electric toaster with the cracked handle at a temperature that is just slightly past perfect, because there is always this small gap between the breakfast someone is supposed to be present for and the breakfast that actually happens when 5 separate people's mornings are managed simultaneously. You butter it anyway, because butter on slightly over-toasted bread produces a result that is adequate and in some ways better than the perfectly timed toast that no one ever quite produces in a real household at 6:45 in the morning, when the coffee is too hot to drink yet and the eggs are still in the pan and one child's shoe is somewhere in the house and has not been located and will need to be located before 7:55. The bread box itself is worth noting, because the bread box of the 1953 American kitchen tells you something specific about how bread was understood. A bread box is a ventilated container designed to maintain the right balance of humidity around a loaf, keeping it from drying out too quickly while also preventing the moisture accumulation that produces mold before the bread is finished. The principle of the bread box is that bread is something you keep, that it has a few days of life that can be managed by proper storage, and that managing it properly is worth the small effort and the counter space. The family that has a bread box is a family that buys bread with some frequency, or bakes it, and uses it over several days rather than treating it as a single occasion food. The bread box is an assumption about domestic life built into an object, the assumption that the household has routines and that bread is part of them. By the early 1960s, the plasticized sliced bread that came in the branded wax paper wrapper had largely displaced the bakery loaf in the American supermarket, and with it came a different storage logic, the twist tie and the bread bag rather than the bread box, the refrigerator as backup rather than the bread box as primary. But in households that retained the habit of the bakery, or in households where someone made their own bread, the bread box continued to do its quiet work on the counter, a wood or tin or enamel container that had no moving parts and required no maintenance, and did exactly one thing with complete reliability. These are the objects that outlast the complicated ones. The percolator deserves its own moment of attention, because the percolator and the drip coffee maker are separated not merely by a technological generation, but by an entire philosophy of time and attentiveness. The percolator works by passing water through the grounds repeatedly over the course of several minutes, a process that is visible, that makes noise, that requires the user to be present with it for the duration, and that produces coffee whose strength depends on how long you let it run, which depends on how attentive you are to the sound it is making, which depends on whether anyone is asking you something while you are trying to listen. The drip coffee maker of the later decades works by passing water through the grounds once, from a reservoir on a timer without requiring your attention at all. You fill the water the night before, set the timer, and in the morning the coffee is there. This is more convenient. It is also the elimination of a small specific interaction with the morning that the percolator required. Whether this is loss or gain is a question that depends on what you think small interactions with the morning are worth. The refrigerator in the mid-century American kitchen occupies a position of genuine cultural importance that is worth taking seriously. Refrigerators in this period were aspirational objects in a way that is difficult to reconstruct from the current vantage point, when refrigerators are utilities, assumed and invisible. In the post-war years, a new refrigerator was a significant purchase, one that reflected not just economic capacity, but a certain orientation toward modern domestic life, toward the convenience and the cleanliness and the management of food over time that a good refrigerator made possible. The colours of the era, the turquoise and the harvest gold and the avocado green, were not merely fashion choices. They were assertions, small declarations that the kitchen was a designed space, a space that someone had thought about aesthetically, not just functionally. The refrigerator was the largest and most visible of these assertions. The food inside the refrigerator of a typical American household in 1963 was organised by a set of principles that were partly formal and partly intuitive, shaped by the specific limitations of the equipment and the specific requirements of the family. The dairy products went on the top shelf where the temperature was most consistent. The meat went on the bottom shelf or in the dedicated meat drawer if the refrigerator had one, because meat's contamination risk made its proximity to other foods a concern even before the formal food safety guidelines of later decades made this principle explicit. The crisper drawers were for vegetables, though the crisper drawers in the refrigerators of this period varied enormously in their actual ability to keep vegetables crisp, and the difference between a refrigerator that actually maintained humidity in the crisper drawer and one that did not was measurable in the lifespan of the lettuce. The weekly meal planning that organised the refrigerator contents was not a formal system in most households, not a written chart on the wall or a spreadsheet, though some households maintained something that approached one. It was more typically a set of understandings held in the cook's mind about what was available, what needed to be used, what could be combined, and what the household's appetite in the current week was likely to require. Monday's roast became Tuesday's hash. Tuesday's hash became Wednesday's soup. Wednesday's soup became Thursday's the children are having sandwiches and it is not worth discussing. This sequencing of leftovers was both practical and creative, requiring the cook to think simultaneously about multiple time horizons, the meal being prepared now and the meals that would follow from what it produced, in a kind of domestic forward planning that was invisible in its sophistication because it was never announced. The A&P, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, which was in 1963 one of the largest grocery chains in the country, provided the materials for this planning in a specific physical environment that had its own logic. The layout of the A&P was not arbitrary. It was designed consciously and with considerable thought to move the shopper through the store in a sequence that maximised exposure to the full range of products, while also meeting the practical requirements of the weekly shopping trip. The produce was typically near the entrance, where it benefited from the natural light, and where its freshness could be assessed before the shopper was committed to the full store. The staples, flour and sugar and canned goods were in the middle of the store, requiring movement through the other departments to reach them. The bread was at the back, requiring the shopper to traverse the full store if bread was the only thing needed, which it rarely was. The checkout line was where the week's meal planning met its accounting. The register in 1961 was a mechanical cash register, not a scanner, requiring the cashier to enter each price manually, a process that was slower than the scanning technology of later decades, and that gave the shopper more time to observe her choices being tallied and to notice if something was priced differently than expected. The process required a cashier with genuine skill, the ability to move quickly through the items while reading the prices correctly and maintaining the running total mentally or on the register tape. These cashiers were skilled professionals who would go largely unrecognised as such in the cultural accounting of their era. The green stamps that many supermarkets and other retailers of the period offered with purchases were a form of loyalty currency that occupied a specific place in the mid-century American domestic economy. You collected the stamps in booklets, the small green squares accumulating over weeks and months, and you could redeem them for merchandise from a catalogue of household goods, appliances, and other items that were otherwise purchased separately. The Sunbeam iron that came with green stamps was the same iron you could buy at the hardware store, but its acquisition through stamps gave it a different quality, something earned rather than simply purchased, a reward for the accumulation of all those small grocery transactions. The woman who tracked her green stamp accumulation and planned her redemption was engaged in a form of thrift and patience that the era valued, and that the stamp programs were designed to cultivate. It was also, of course, designed to keep her shopping at the same stores, which it reliably did. The church social, the neighbourhood potluck, the bridge club luncheon, and the PTA meeting all represented occasions in the 1960s American domestic calendar that required a specific kind of domestic contribution. The presented dish, the thing you brought that would be set out on the table alongside what others brought and that would be eaten and commented on and remembered, either as a success or as that casserole that always separated a little at the edges, which is not a failure but a specific kind of memory. These occasions were a form of social evaluation that was rarely acknowledged directly, but that everyone understood, a venue in which domestic competence was displayed and assessed, and compared in ways that were too gentle to be called competition, but too consistent to be entirely innocent of competitive impulse. The woman who brought the 7-layer dip to the PTA meeting in 1963, before 7-layer dip existed as a concept, brought instead the cold green bean salad with the French dressing or the ambrosia with the tiny marshmallows and the mandarin oranges from the can, or the deviled eggs with the paprika on top set in the deviled egg plate with the oval indentations that held each egg half in its proper orientation. The deviled egg plate was a specific object with a specific social function, and the woman who owned one and used it was signalling something about her relationship to the occasion, her willingness to take the presentation seriously, her understanding that a deviled egg served in the carrier designed for deviled eggs was a different deviled egg than a deviled egg placed on a flat plate and allowed to slide. Details like this were what the magazines and the home economics textbooks were teaching, and the teaching was received and applied and calibrated and sometimes rejected in every household in every decade by women who were making continuous small decisions about how to inhabit the standards of their particular time and place. The social texture of the 1960s neighbourhood was held together by these shared occasions, by the informal networks of exchange, the borrowed cup of sugar and the returned plate of cookies, and the conversation over the back fence about the new family down the street. Suburban neighbourhoods in this period had a particular intensity of social proximity that was not universal, that varied by region and by the specific character of the development, and by whether the neighbourhood had had time to develop its own culture, but that existed in a sufficient number of places to constitute a real feature of the era. Neighbours knew each other's names and their children's names, and the general outline of their situations. The woman who was not seen for several days was noticed. The household in difficulty could receive practical assistance without a formal request, because the informal networks of awareness were sensitive enough to detect the need before it had been articulated. This proximity was not purely comfortable. The same networks that could deliver a casserole to a household in crisis could also deliver a judgment, not stated directly but present nonetheless in the slight alteration of the conversation, the comment that landed oddly, the advice offered in the guise of observation. The suburban neighbourhood of the post-war decades was a social environment that offered genuine community and genuine constraint simultaneously, and navigating it required the same kind of attentiveness that the kitchen required, the reading of the room, the management of the gap between what was desired and what was appropriate, the ongoing calibration of what you presented and how. The children in this world moved through its social texture in their own way, absorbing its norms and its language and its understanding of how things were done with the specificity and the unconsciousness of children, learning from proximity rather than instruction what the standards were, what the expectations were, what a well-run household looked like and what it required. Learning this not as a lesson but as the furniture of their experience, the world as it simply was, as it had always been, as it would presumably continue to be until they were grown and building their own version of it. Some of them would. Some of them would build something significantly different. But the world they grew up in, with its percolators and its ironing boards and its bread boxes and its A&P and its green stamps and its bridge club luncheons and its competent, invisible, never quite finished domestic labour, would stay with them in the body in the way that the world of childhood always does, present even after its specific forms have changed, carried in the particular quality of a Tuesday morning, or the smell of something slow, cooking in an oven, or the specific weight of a properly ironed shirt pulled from the hanger. There was never a Betty Crocker. This is the thing that takes people a moment even now, even knowing what they know about advertising and corporate mythology, and the long American tradition of inventing a wholesome face to put in front of a product. You know the name. You have seen the signature in red ink looping and assured on the cookbook that may have lived in your grandmother's kitchen, or your mother's kitchen, or your own kitchen still, the spine worn soft from being opened flat on the counter and propped against the flour canister. You know the face from the portrait on the box, the carefully arranged hair, the warm but authoritative expression, the look of a woman who has baked everything and knows exactly what she is doing and will tell you plainly. That face was real, more or less, in the sense that it was painted from a real woman's features, but the woman herself, the woman who supposedly signed her name in that confident red script and answered cooking questions, and appeared on the radio and became one of the most recognised figures in American domestic life. She was invented. And the story of how she was invented, and what she became, and what that reveals about the anxieties and ambitions of the American kitchen in the 20th century, is one of the more quietly remarkable stories in the history of everyday life. The story begins in 1921 at the Washburn Crosby Company, a flour milling operation based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that would eventually become General Mills. That year, the company ran a promotional contest, as companies in the 1920s frequently did, involving a jigsaw puzzle depicting a milling scene, and offered prizes to customers who could complete it. The response was significant. Thousands of entries came back, and a large number of them included written questions. Questions about baking, about flour, about techniques and temperatures and the specific ways that bread dough behaves in dry climates versus humid ones. Real questions from real women who wanted real answers. The executives at Washburn Crosbie understood that they needed to respond to these questions. Leaving them unanswered was not simply impolite, it was a business problem, because the women writing in were customers, and customers who felt ignored stopped buying. So a decision was made to create a signature, a name that could be attached to the company's written responses, something that would feel personal and warm and female, because the people asking the baking questions were almost all women, and a response that felt as if it came from a woman who understood their world would carry far more weight than a response from a corporate entity with a milling wheel in its letterhead. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. A contest was held internally. Female employees of the company were invited to submit name suggestions. The surname Crocker was chosen in honour of a recently retired director of the company, William Crocker, who was well liked and whose name carried no particular baggage. The first name Betty was chosen because it sounded to the ears of the people making the decision in 1921, friendly and familiar and reassuring, the name of the woman who lived next door and knew what she was doing with a pie crust. And from a pool of submitted signatures, one was selected as the official Betty Crocker signature, submitted by a company employee whose name was not preserved in the historical record, or perhaps was preserved somewhere and later lost, the way so many of the names of women who did the actual work of things tend to get lost. From the beginning, Betty Crocker was what you might call a collaborative fiction, built not from a single imagination but from the combined efforts of the women who actually ran what quickly became the Betty Crocker homemaking service. These were real women, home economists with professional training and genuine expertise, who answered the letters and developed the recipes and, crucially, understood what the women writing in actually needed. And what they needed, it turned out, was enormous in scope. The letters that came to Betty Crocker in the 1920s and 30s covered everything from basic bread baking to questions about how to manage a kitchen budget during the Depression, to deeply personal questions about failure and disappointment, cakes that had not risen, husbands who had not noticed, dinners that had not come together in the way the magazine photographs suggested they should. Betty Crocker answered them all in a voice that was warm and competent and slightly encouraging, the voice of a woman who had encountered these problems herself and had solutions. The radio arrived and Betty Crocker went with it. Beginning in 1924, a program called the Betty Crocker Cooking School of the Air went out over the airwaves, first regionally, then nationally. A series of real women played Betty Crocker on the radio, their voices carefully coached toward a particular register. Warm but authoritative, practical but not cold, the voice of someone who takes baking seriously without taking herself too seriously. Millions of women listened. The show became one of the longest-running programs in radio history. Women who grew up in the 1930s and 40s remembered it with the same specificity with which they remembered other fixtures of domestic childhood, the smell of their mother's kitchen on a Sunday morning, the sound of the radio in the afternoon, Betty Crocker's voice coming through the speaker with instructions for a layer cake that could be made with the ingredients in a wartime kitchen. In 1936, General Mills, which had absorbed Washburn Crosbie in 1928, commissioned an official Betty Crocker portrait. The artist Nasa McMean, a well-known illustrator of the period, created a composite image drawn from the features of multiple General Mills home economists. The result was a face that looked, with remarkable precision, like the face you would design if you asked a focus group in 1936 to imagine the ideal American home economist. The hair was neat, the expression was confident without being intimidating, the clothes were professional without being unfeminine. The overall impression was of a woman who had thought carefully about what you were dealing with in your kitchen and had some very good ideas about it. That portrait was updated 7 times over the course of the 20th century, each update calibrated to reflect the visual language of its moment. The 1955 Betty Crocker looked more polished, more post-war, her hair more deliberately set. The 1968 version had a slightly more modern quality, reflecting the slow, tentative shift in how women's roles were being discussed in American culture. By the 1980s, the portrait was softer, less formally posed. By the 1996 update, General Mills had commissioned a computerized composite drawn from the faces of 75 women of diverse backgrounds, an attempt to make Betty Crocker's face feel less like one specific type of woman, and more like a reflection of the full range of American women who had been using her recipes for 3/4 of a century. The cookbook, when it came, was something no one had anticipated quite on the scale it delivered. The Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook was published in 1950, a red and white checked board cover volume that has never been out of print since. It was an immediate sensation, not simply because it contained good recipes, though it did, but because of the tone in which those recipes were delivered. Betty Crocker's voice on the page was the same voice that had come through the radio for 25 years, the same voice that had answered thousands of letters from women who did not know why their bread would not rise or their custard kept curdling. It was a voice that assumed the reader's intelligence while also assuming that no question was too basic to answer clearly, and that combination turned out to be almost exactly what the post-war American kitchen wanted. The recipes themselves were calibrated with precision. They accounted for the refrigerators and electric stoves and standardized measuring cups and level teaspoons that had become common in American kitchens by 1950, tools that had not been universal a generation earlier. They were written to be followed by someone with intermediate experience, without requiring that experience to be acknowledged, which meant that a woman new to keeping her own kitchen could follow them successfully, and a more experienced cook would not feel condescended to. It was a difficult balance to achieve in recipe writing, and the home economist who wrote the book achieved it, though of course the credit went to Betty. General Mills understood something that is worth sitting with for a moment. In the post-war years, enormous numbers of American women were setting up their first independent households, young women who had grown up during the Depression and the war years, who in many cases had not had the opportunity to learn domestic skills from their mothers in the traditional way because their mothers had been working or managing on reduced means or simply surviving. These women found themselves in gleaming new kitchens, in new suburban houses, with new appliances and a social expectation of domestic competence that they did not always feel they possessed. Betty Crocker spoke directly to that anxiety. She did not acknowledge the anxiety because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging a gap between the ideal and the reality that advertisers in 1950 were not interested in naming. She simply provided competence, warmly, reliably, page after page. The relationship that American women formed with Betty Crocker had a quality that is genuinely interesting to examine. Surveys conducted over several decades found that significant numbers of women believed Betty Crocker to be a real person, which seems surprising until you consider that she had spoken to them on the radio, answered their letters in her own handwriting, appeared in photographs and portraits, and offered advice that was consistently accurate and useful. The signals of realness were all present, only the person was absent. And in the American domestic world of the 1940s and 50s, the presence of reliable, personal, practical guidance from another woman felt real enough that the absence of the actual body behind it did not register as the fundamental fiction it was. There were women at General Mills who spent their entire careers as Betty Crocker, answering letters and developing recipes and speaking on the radio, women whose names appear in almost no historical account of the brand they built. Marjorie Child Husted was perhaps the most influential of them, the home economist who shaped Betty Crocker's voice and personality during the 1930s and 40s, and who ran what amounted to a significant communications and consumer education operation, all under a name that was not hers. She was Betty Crocker in every meaningful professional sense for years, and when she was eventually recognised publicly, it was not as Betty Crocker, but as the person behind Betty Crocker, a distinction that carries its own particular kind of erasure. The Betty Crocker cookbook has sold more than 75 million copies. The name appears on more than 200 products. The signature, that looping, confident red script, is one of the most reproduced images in American commercial history. And at the centre of all of it is a kind of magnificent, very American invention. A woman assembled from everything women were supposed to be, warm and competent and reliable and practical and modestly reassuring, who existed specifically to sell them flour and recipes, and the idea that the kitchen, properly managed, was a domain in which they could be confident, successful, and even quietly celebrated. Whether that was a gift or a constraint, or both at the same time, is a question that does not have a single clean answer. but it is very much the right question to ask. The kitchen she presided over, that warm, well-organised, well-equipped American kitchen of the post-war decades, was also a real place that real women worked in every day, women who may or may not have had her cookbook on the shelf, who were trying to produce the same reliable results it promised, with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of support, in a system that was more complicated than any cookbook, however thorough, ever quite acknowledged. And that kitchen, and those women, are worth looking at more closely, not through the lens of the portrait on the box, but through the specific, unglamorous, genuinely extraordinary reality of what the work actually required. The success of Betty Crocker as a cultural entity cannot be separated from the specific anxieties of the women she was designed to address, and those anxieties shifted over the decades in ways that the brand had to track carefully. In the 1920s and 30s, the anxiety was fundamentally practical. The American housewife of 1925 was often managing a kitchen that lacked running hot water, reliable refrigeration, and standardized equipment. Recipes written for one kitchen might fail catastrophically in another because oven temperatures were inconsistent, flour was measured differently across regions, and the quality of basic ingredients varied enormously. What Betty Crocker offered in those early years was essentially a reliable standard, a voice that could be trusted to have tested the recipe in conditions that approximated your own, and to have found the version that worked. The Depression years added a different layer to what Betty Crocker needed to be. The letters that came in during the 1930s changed in character. They were less often questions about technique, and more often questions about substitution, about what could be left out or replaced when the budget was genuinely insufficient, about how to make something nourishing from very little, about how to maintain a sense of domestic normalcy in circumstances that were making normalcy difficult. The women who answered these letters as Betty Crocker were thinking seriously about this, developing recipes and suggestions that were practical in a Depression kitchen in ways that a recipe designed for the more prosperous 20s was not. The voice that came through maintained its warmth and its practicality, but it had acquired a kind of solidarity, an acknowledgement, implicit rather than stated, that the women writing in were not failing at something they should be succeeding at, but were rather managing something genuinely difficult with the resources they had. The war years required another recalibration. Rationing changed what was available. Sugar, butter, meat, and other staples that formed the foundation of American cooking suddenly existed within specific limits that could not be ignored, and the recipes that Betty Crocker provided during the war years were exercises in creative constraint. How to bake a cake without full butter rations, how to produce a satisfying meat dish when the meat available was limited, how to substitute honey or molasses for rationed sugar in ways that actually worked, rather than simply producing a result that reminded everyone of what they were missing. This was not merely a recipe problem, it was a chemistry problem and a psychology problem simultaneously, because a wartime cake that was also a good cake provided something beyond nutrition, something about maintaining the rhythms and pleasures of domestic life under conditions that were actively trying to disrupt them. The post-war Betty Crocker emerged into a very different landscape. The women writing to her now were not managing scarcity, they were managing abundance. And abundance, it turned out, had its own set of complications. The new suburban kitchen was equipped with appliances and pantry staples that the wartime kitchen had not had. The supermarket offered a range of choices that the corner grocery of the 30s had not offered. The home economics curriculum in schools had expanded to include new information about nutrition and food science. And the women setting up their first independent households in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s were in many cases the first generation of their families to have grown up in a context where domestic skills were not transmitted naturally from mother to daughter through daily proximity because their own mothers had been working during the war years, or living in smaller spaces, or managing their own disruptions. The Betty Crocker picture cookbook arrived for these women like something they had not known they were waiting for. It was comprehensive in a way that assumed you might be starting from very close to zero without ever saying so. The instructions were specific enough to follow without previous knowledge, but were written in a voice that addressed you as a capable adult who could understand the reason for a step if it was explained. When it told you to cream the butter and sugar until light and fluffy, it explained why this mattered, what the air incorporated in that step would do later in the baking process, so that the instruction was not simply an order to be followed, but a piece of information about how baking actually worked, information that would allow you to recognise when you had done it correctly and when you had not. The cookbook was also, and this is worth noticing, a social object. It appeared in wedding gift registries. It was given by mothers to daughters on the occasion of setting up a first home. It was shared between neighbours and loaned and occasionally not returned, which is its own kind of compliment. The copy that was used, really used, had cooking stains on certain pages, spatter marks near the recipes that were made frequently enough to make their own kind of annotation, a physical record of the meals that had been made and the occasions they had served. A well-used copy of the Betty Crocker picture cookbook was a document of a domestic life, and the women who owned them understood this without necessarily articulating it. The relationship between General Mills and the women who engaged with Betty Crocker was not simply commercial, though it was also commercial, and being honest about the commercial element is part of being honest about the whole picture. General Mills was a flour company. They needed women to buy flour. Betty Crocker was, at one level, a very sophisticated mechanism for building brand loyalty in the specific demographic that purchased the product. Every letter answered, every recipe provided, every radio program broadcast, every cookbook sold, was simultaneously an act of genuine service and an act of commercial cultivation. And these two things were not in contradiction, because the genuine service actually worked. The recipes were actually good, the advice was actually useful, and women who got good results from Betty Crocker's recipes bought Betty Crocker's flour, which was the commercial point. This is not cynicism. It is a description of how the relationship actually functioned, which was more mutually beneficial than purely exploitative, though it was also not a relationship between equals, because one party was a major corporation with significant resources and sophisticated marketing capacity, and the other party was an individual woman writing a letter about why her bread would not rise, who did not know and could not know the full structure of the relationship she was in. The home economists who answered her letter were not deceiving her. They were answering her question, and they were answering it well. But the answer came wrapped in a name and a brand that served interests. The woman writing the letter was not in a position to fully evaluate, and that asymmetry is worth naming even in an account that wants to be fair to the genuine usefulness of what Betty Crocker provided. The influence that Betty Crocker had on the American kitchen is measurable in certain ways, in cookbook sales and radio ratings and brand recognition surveys, and in other ways that are harder to quantify. Entire generations of American women learned to make certain dishes from Betty Crocker recipes, made them regularly, adapted them over time, passed them to their own daughters, who adapted them further. The specific combination of flavours in the Betty Crocker Devil's Food Cake, developed in the 1930s and refined through the following decades, became, for a significant number of American families, the definitive version of Devil's Food Cake, the one against which other versions were unconsciously measured. This is how cultural authority works. It is not announced, it simply accumulates until it becomes the baseline against which other things are compared. The men who ran General Mills throughout the era of Betty Crocker's greatest influence would have been unlikely to describe themselves as being in the business of providing emotional support to American women, but the letters that came in, and the nature of the questions asked, and the gratitude that came back after the answers were provided, suggest that something that functioned like emotional support was in fact one of the primary things Betty Crocker delivered. The voice was reliable, the advice was consistent, the name appeared on the same products year after year, in a culture that was changing rapidly in many other ways, in a domestic world that was often isolated, in which expertise was not always available from family or neighbours, in which the gap between the ideal kitchen and the actual kitchen was sometimes a source of genuine distress. Having a trusted voice that could be consulted by letter, or by cookbook, or by radio program was not a small thing. It was not therapy, and it was not friendship, but it was something adjacent to both. Something that served a genuine need that no one had sat down and formally identified, but that existed nonetheless, measurable in the volume of mail that arrived at Minneapolis for decades. Betty Crocker still exists, of course. The signature still appears. The cookbook is still in print, updated through its many editions to reflect the kitchens and the dietary knowledge and the cooking technology of each successive period. The portrait has not been updated since 1996. The voice has adapted, as it always has, to what the current moment requires from it. But the core of what she was, a reliable, practical, warmly competent presence in the kitchen that could be trusted to help you make something that would actually work. That core has not changed, because the need it was built to address has not changed. People still want to make things that work. They still need to know why the bread did not rise. They still sometimes need to feel that the question they are asking, however basic, is a reasonable question that deserves a respectful answer. Betty Crocker was not a real person, but she was a real response to a real need, and the women who built her, who answered the letters and developed the recipes and spoke in her voice on the radio and made sure that the recipes in the cookbook actually worked, those women were as real as anyone who ever stood at a kitchen counter and tried to make something good from what was in front of them. You arrive at 7:45 because the shift starts at 8, and Mr. Hollis, the floor manager, has made it reasonably clear that arriving at 8 means you're already behind. The store does not open until 9, but the hour before opening belongs to preparation, and preparation is one of the things you're expected to be good at, which you are because you have been working this counter for 14 months, and you have long since stopped thinking consciously about the order in which things need to happen. You take your coat to the back room, hang it on the hook with your name on the paper tag above it, pin on your name badge, Margaret, in the round dark blue plastic with the white letters that are starting to get slightly cloudy, and return to the floor. Woolworths in 1961 smells like a specific combination of things that you have stopped registering individually and now receive as a single composite smell that means work. Popcorn from the popcorn machine near the front, which will not be running yet but whose ghost smell never fully clears. Rubber from the toy section 2 aisles over. The particular sweetness of the candy bins near the register. Something underneath all of it that might be floor wax and might be the building itself, which is old. Not elderly, but a certain kind of well-established old that holds its particular smell in the walls and the floor and the wooden surfaces of the display counters. Your section is cosmetics and notions. You're responsible for the stretch of counter that runs from the lipstick display to the end of the thread and button section, and every morning before opening you check the inventory, refill what is low, face the products forward on the shelf, and make sure that the display case glass is clean. The glass cleaning takes longer than you would like because the children who come in on weekdays after school leave fingerprints at specific heights along the case, the heights corresponding to their particular ages and enthusiasms, and the fingerprints from yesterday, which you cleaned yesterday, have been replaced overnight by fresh ones in approximately the same locations because the same children come in every day. You have made a kind of peace with this. The lipstick display requires careful attention every morning because customers handle lipsticks the way they handle nothing else in the store, with a kind of intimate assessment that involves picking them up, turning them over, reading the colour names, unscrewing the caps, and sometimes, despite the small sign asking them not to, trying them on. The display has 74 individual lipstick slots across 3 rows, in a range that goes from the palest, almost nude pink that older women favour to the darkest near red that the high school girls buy when they are feeling bold, and at any given point in the day, some number of those slots will be empty or in the wrong position, or have a lipstick pointing the wrong direction, and your job is to keep them organised with the patience of someone who has fully accepted that this is an ongoing project rather than a problem to be solved. The thread and button section at the far end of your counter requires a different kind of attention. It is a reference section, in a way, because the women who come to buy thread and buttons are usually looking for a specific thing, a colour to match a dress they have at home or a button to replace one that came off a coat, and they need your help finding it. You have learned the thread inventory with a specificity that occasionally surprises you. You know that the navy blue in shade 12 is slightly lighter than the navy blue in shade 11, a distinction that matters enormously when you are matching thread to a navy dress with a particular dye, and you know this not from reading anything but from helping customers with this problem approximately twice a week, until the knowledge became automatic. 9 o'clock comes and the doors open with the sound of the lock turning and the slight rush of outside air that happens every morning when the glass door swings in and the first hour of the retail day begins. The first hour on a Tuesday has its own character, distinct from the Saturday first hour, which is urgent and crowded, and the Monday first hour, which tends to be quiet and purposeful, women coming in to return something from the weekend or buy something they forgot. Tuesday morning, Woolworths is women with time, women who are not rushing, women who have parked the car and have an hour before they need to be somewhere else, and are moving through the store with the particular kind of unhurried attention that produces actual shopping rather than efficient errand running. A woman in a yellow coat stops at the lipstick display. You watch her from a slight angle, not looking directly because looking directly makes people feel observed, and observed people hurry, and hurrying people do not buy lipstick. She picks up a shade called Coral Promise, which is in the range that tends toward the warm peachy side of the spectrum, and turns it over to read the label. You have seen this particular shade picked up and put down approximately 100 times in 14 months. You know that about a third of the women who pick it up will buy it, and that the third who buy it will be, statistically, happy with the choice, and the 2/3 who put it down will pick up something slightly darker or slightly lighter, and most of them will also buy something. The cosmetics counter is, in this way, a very legible place once you have watched it long enough. She looks up and catches your eye, which means she has decided to ask something. You move to her end of the counter. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. She wants to know if the colour will look too pink on someone with her complexion, and she gestures at her face in the specific way that women gesture at their own faces in cosmetic stores, a kind of presentation of the evidence. You look at her complexion, which is fair with a slight warmth in the undertone, and you look at Coral Promise, which reads warm peachy coral in the case but runs slightly pinker on the lip, and you tell her honestly that it might pull a little pink on her, and you suggest she also look at Warm Apricot, which is in the slot 2 down and 3 across, and which tends to read warmer and less pink, and which you have seen work on exactly her complexion on at least 6 occasions that you can recall without thinking hard. She takes both. She ends up buying the Warm Apricot. This is one of the parts of the job that you are good at and that you do not entirely know how to explain to someone who is not standing at this counter. It is not just product knowledge, though it requires product knowledge. It is a kind of reading of the person, what they actually want as distinct from what they say they want, and what will make them feel good about the transaction when they get home and try the lipstick on in their own bathroom mirror. Getting this right matters in ways that are not strictly commercial, because a customer who buys the right thing comes back, and a customer who buys the wrong thing also comes back, but with the receipt and a slightly different energy. The morning moves through its particular rhythms. A girl of perhaps 13 comes in with 2 friends during what must be a study hall period, and they spend 20 minutes at the cosmetics counter, picking up every lipstick in sequence and reading the names aloud to each other, which is essentially the same as trying every lipstick socially. You watch them without apparent watchfulness, which is one of the skills the job has required you to develop, because the teenage girls from the high school 2 blocks over are not consistent shoplifters, but they are not shoplifters either, and the distinction tends to resolve itself based on whether they feel watched. These 3 buy nothing but a card of bobby pins and leave giggling, and the lipstick display is in slightly worse condition than before they arrived, but not catastrophically so, and you spend 4 minutes restoring it while keeping track of the 3 other customers currently in your section. Your break is at 11, 15 minutes in the back room with a cup of coffee from the communal pot that is on a side table near the lockers, and is almost always of uncertain age but hot. You sit with Sandra from the housewares section, who has been at Woolworths for 4 years, and who knows things about the store and Mr. Hollis and the district manager, and the politics of the annual employee review, that you absorb without necessarily needing all of it, but that give you a clearer picture of the landscape you are working inside. Sandra has been trying to get moved to the candy counter for 2 years, because the candy counter does higher volume, and there is a small commission structure attached to it that the cosmetics counter does not have. She will tell you this again today, not because she has forgotten she has told you, but because telling it is part of how she manages feeling stuck. You listen, because listening is something the job has made you considerably better at, for the same reason it has made you better at reading what a customer actually wants, as opposed to what she says she wants. The lunch hour arrives and the store gets louder and more crowded in the particular way that lunch hours in retail always do, the traffic compressing into a shorter window with a different energy. Women who have an hour and are not going to spend it browsing, but are going to buy what they came for and leave. You move faster. Your answers to questions are slightly shorter, not curt but efficient, and the customers recognise the register of this, and mostly respond in kind. The lunch rush at the cosmetics counter is mostly replacement buying, women who have run out of the foundation they use or the mascara they like, and need a new one without having to make a decision, and you are very good at this kind of transaction. because you have learned that the most useful thing you can do for a customer who knows what she wants is confirm that she wants it and help her find it quickly. By 2 in the afternoon, the store has settled back into a midday quiet that is neither the morning unhurry nor the lunch urgency, but something more ambient. Older women come in during the 2 o'clock hour, women who are shopping because shopping is a form of movement, and movement is pleasant on a Tuesday afternoon when the children are in school and the house is quiet. They linger at the display cases and read the labels carefully, and sometimes want to tell you things about themselves, about the lipstick colour they wore when they were young, about a perfume they used to buy here that is no longer available, about their daughter who has her father's complexion and can wear warm colours that the mother herself cannot. You listen to these things because the listening is part of the transaction, and because you are genuinely interested most of the time in the information. Your feet have been on this floor since 7:45, and by 3 in the afternoon the floor is making itself known in the way that linoleum on concrete makes itself known over hours, a specific fatigue that starts in the heel and works its way up through the arch and into the lower back, the unmistakable signature of a day spent standing. You have shoes that are designed for this, wide-toed, low-heeled, sensible, in the way that working shoes are always sensible, and flattering in the way that working shoes are almost never flattering, and they help. But they do not solve the fundamental problem, which is that the human body did not evolve to stand on concrete floors for 8 hours a day, and no shoe design has fully corrected for that gap in the evolutionary record. The afternoon shift at Woolworths has a slightly different crew than the morning. Students from the college 2 miles away come in at 2 to work the toy section and the record department, younger, slightly less experienced, and you feel toward them a mixture of patience and mild authority that you did not expect to feel at 23, which is what you are. You show them things occasionally, how to face a display properly, how to read a customer's hesitation, the particular way Mr. Hollis prefers inventory to be labelled without making it feel like instruction, because instruction from a peer lands better when it does not announce itself as instruction. At 5 o'clock your relief arrives and you sign out at the register in the back and retrieve your coat, and stand for a moment in the back room doing what you always do at the end of a shift, which is not quite rest and not quite thinking, but a brief pause in which your body takes stock of itself and your mind releases whatever the last hour of the day was holding. Your feet are tired. Your back is in the early stages of making a complaint it will finish making later this evening. You have had approximately 47 distinct conversations about cosmetics products today, of which roughly 32 resulted in a purchase, and the rest in some degree of genuine assistance that may eventually result in a purchase, or may not. You walk out through the store's front door, past the display window that you pass every morning on the way in and have stopped seeing, past the popcorn machine, past the little girls pulling at their mother's hands near the toy section. The evening air comes from somewhere slightly cool, and you breathe it in with the specific pleasure of someone who's been breathing the inside of a building since 7:45 in the morning. Tomorrow your section will need restocking and the lipstick display will need to be reorganised because it always does, and there will be customers who want to be read and others who want to be left alone, and a few who want both at different points in the same conversation, and you will manage all of it because you're good at this, legitimately good at it, in a way that is easy to overlook and hard to name, but that is, at its core, a sophisticated social skill that very few people could replicate if they tried. The job does not say so. The paycheck does not say so. But you know it, in the quiet way that you know the things that take years of standing attention to learn. And knowing it, even quietly, even only to yourself, is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite a lot. There is a social architecture to the 5 and dime that is not immediately visible when you walk in as a customer, and that is almost completely invisible unless you have worked one. The store is not simply a collection of goods for sale. It is a carefully organised social environment with its own hierarchy and its own rules and its own logic, and understanding that logic is part of what the job requires, as much as knowing the merchandise and knowing where things are and knowing how to count change back correctly when the cash register is not doing it for you. The hierarchy at Woolworths in 1961 runs in several directions simultaneously. There is the management hierarchy, which is formal and visible, Mr. Hollis at the top, the shift supervisors below him, the senior sales clerks below them, the newer hires at the bottom. This hierarchy communicates through the formal channels of the workplace, the schedule board, and the memos from the district office, and the periodic reviews that happen in Mr. Hollis's small office at the back of the store, where he sits behind a metal desk and tells you what you're doing well and what you need to work on, and whether the district numbers are where they should be. You have had 3 of these reviews. You understand by now that the reviews are not primarily about your performance, though they address your performance, but about the district's performance, and that your individual contribution is meaningful to Mr. Hollis primarily insofar as it contributes to numbers that will be reported upward to people who do not know your name. There is also the informal hierarchy, which is older and in some ways more powerful. Sandra from Housewares occupies a specific position in this hierarchy that has nothing to do with her job title and everything to do with her knowledge of the store's history, its personalities, its accumulated grievances and alliances. Sandra knows things about the stockroom procedures and the holiday schedule, and the unwritten rules about which customers are likely to be difficult, and which salesgirls Mr. Hollis favours, and which ones he has mentally categorised as temporary, regardless of what their contracts say. This knowledge is power in a small way, but a real way, and Sandra dispenses it selectively, and you have been a recipient of enough of it by now to understand that being in Sandra's confidence is worth maintaining. The customers have their own taxonomy, which you have developed over 14 months without ever writing it down. There are the regulars, women who come in on a schedule so consistent that you know approximately when to expect them and approximately what they are likely to be looking for. Mrs. Hartley comes in every other Thursday for face powder, the Coty Natural, and she always asks whether you have gotten in the new display of compacts, even though the new display of compacts arrives on a cycle that has nothing to do with her Thursday visits. She's not actually looking for the compacts, she's looking for a conversation about the compacts, which you have learned to provide in a way that satisfies the real need without requiring the compacts to actually be there. There is the woman who comes in irregularly but always in the early afternoon, and always to buy something for a grandchild, a hair ribbon or a small toy from the section 2 aisles over, and who wants to tell you about the grandchild at some length before she selects the item. You have learned to recognise her before she reaches your counter by a certain quality of her movement, a looking around that is not quite shopping, but more like gathering herself before the social transaction she has come in for. There are the difficult customers, the ones who approach the counter already somewhere between uncertain and annoyed, carrying a dissatisfaction that may or may not have originated with you, but that you will be expected to absorb and redirect without adding to it. These interactions require a specific kind of emotional management that no one trained you for, but that you have developed through the experience of doing it, the ability to remain pleasant without being false, to hear a complaint that is not entirely reasonable and respond to the reasonable part of it, to suggest alternatives without making the customer feel that you have dismissed what she asked for. This is genuinely difficult. It is more difficult than the straightforward transactions, and more difficult than the lingering customers who want to talk, because it requires active management of a negative energy, while simultaneously serving a commercial need and maintaining a manner that Mr. Hollis, if he happens to be watching from the other end of the floor, will find acceptable. You have become good at this. You have become good at it the same way you have become good at everything else about this job, through repetition and through the consequences of doing it badly early on and adjusting. The lunch counter at the back of the store is not your section, but it is part of your world in the way that everything inside these walls is part of your world for the 8 hours you are inside them. The lunch counter runs on its own rhythm, faster than the retail floor, more conversational, organised around the specific demands of serving food to people who have a limited time to eat it. The women who work the lunch counter are a distinct social group within the store's ecology, more physically active, more constantly in motion, managing a different kind of pressure than the pressure of the sales floor, the pressure of the immediate, of the order that needs to be filled now rather than the customer who needs to be helped now but whose now is more flexible. You eat your lunch at the counter sometimes, on days when the back room is occupied or when you want a few minutes of the particular kind of company that the counter provides, which is the company of people in motion, a kind of social environment that does not require sustained attention, but that provides a sense of being among people without requiring the performance that the sales floor requires. On these days, you order the tuna melt or the grilled cheese, and you eat quickly because 15 minutes is not a long time, and you watch the counter girls work with a kind of professional appreciation, the way people who are good at one difficult thing tend to recognize difficulty in another. The merchandise in your section changes seasonally in ways that require you to maintain an ongoing familiarity with what is coming and when, because customers will ask about items that are not on the floor yet, or that have not come in, or that were ordered but arrived in the wrong colour, and your ability to answer these questions accurately depends on knowing the ordering cycle, and the delivery schedule and the specific constraints of the store's relationship with its suppliers, which you know not because anyone explained it to you systematically, but because you have been paying attention for 14 months to the patterns of what arrives and when and why certain things are sometimes delayed. The Christmas season is in a category of its own. You have worked 2 Christmas seasons at Woolworths, and each one has clarified certain things about human behaviour under conditions of mild commercial pressure that you did not know before working retail, and that you will probably carry with you for the rest of your working life. People who are ordinarily pleasant become slightly less pleasant when they cannot find what they came for, and the holiday is approaching, and the store is crowded, and the particular item they needed is sold out because everyone else needed it too. People who are ordinarily indifferent to the people serving them sometimes at Christmas become unexpectedly warm, bringing in small things, a box of chocolates left on the counter without a word, or simply saying something kind in a way that suggests they have been thinking about saying it for a while. The Christmas season is the period during which the full spectrum of what people are like when they are slightly under pressure and slightly in need of something is most clearly visible. And working it has given you a specific, detailed, and not entirely comfortable education in that spectrum. The pay is not enough. This is simply a fact about the job that exists alongside all the other facts about the job, and that you have accepted in the way that working people accept things that are true, but not changeable by individual will. You make enough to contribute to your household. You live with your parents still, which makes the contribution feel different than it would if you were living independently, and the question of whether and when you will live independently is one that exists in the back of your mind during quiet moments on the sales floor, during the slow Tuesday mornings and the early Thursday lulls, as a question that connects to other questions about what your life is supposed to look like and what you want it to look like and whether those are the same thing. The 5 and dime is not where you intended to end up, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that you did not have a precise intention about where you would end up when you graduated from high school 4 years ago, and the 5 and dime was available and paid and required skills you had and has provided, in its particular way, an education in things that no high school curriculum addressed. How to read people, how to manage a long day on your feet, how to be useful in ways that are specific and real even when they are not glamorous, how to maintain a professional manner in circumstances that test the professional manner, how to find the small satisfactions of a job done well, the lipstick that goes to the right person, the thread colour matched precisely, the difficult customer turned into a satisfied one, in a context where no one is likely to notice the specific achievement, but where the achievement is real nonetheless. By the end of a full week, by Friday at 5 o'clock when you sign out and walk through the store for the last time until Monday, you carry a particular kind of fatigue that is partly physical and partly something else, something more like saturation, the accumulation of several hundred brief social transactions, each of which required some fraction of your attention and your energy and your carefully maintained professional self. The fatigue is real. It is also not the only thing you carry. You carry also the knowledge that you are good at this, specifically demonstrably good at it, in ways that the job has confirmed through the repetition of its small daily confirmations. The customer who came back for the lipstick you suggested, the woman who asked for you specifically on a day when you were not on the floor, the moment when Sandra told you, in the specific sideways way that Sandra tells people things, that Mr. Hollis had mentioned to her that your numbers were good, which is as close to a direct compliment as the store's culture produces. You are 23, and you work at a Woolworths and your feet hurt on Friday evenings, and the pay is not enough. These things are true. Also true, and maybe worth holding alongside those things, is that you spend 40 hours a week doing something real, something that requires and develops genuine skill, in the company of people who are also doing something real, in a place that is part of the texture of the city around you, in a way that matters to the people who use it. The 5 and dime is not a glamorous institution, but it is a useful one, and being useful to it in a real way, for 8 hours a day, is not nothing. It is, in the specific accounting of a working life, something you can be quietly proud of, even if the culture around you has not quite figured out how to say so. The photographs are worth looking at carefully, not for what they show, but for what they do not show. The American kitchen of the post-war decades, as captured in the women's magazines and the product advertisements and the home economics textbooks of the 1950s and early 1960s, is a room of remarkable orderliness. The countertops are clear, the appliances gleam in pastel colours, turquoise and harvest gold and soft avocado green, their surfaces innocent of grease or fingerprints, or the watermarks that accumulate around a sink used 20 times a day. The woman standing in the kitchen is similarly composed, her hair set, her dress ironed, her expression carrying that particular quality of cheerful competence that the era's commercial imagery had essentially standardized as the face of American womanhood. Everything in the frame is telling you that this is manageable, that this room, properly equipped and properly inhabited, produces not just food but a kind of domestic harmony that is available to any woman willing to apply herself. What the photographs did not show was the 45 minutes before the photograph was taken and what those 45 minutes actually contained. The gap between the gleaming image of the post-war American kitchen and the lived experience of the women working inside it is not a small gap, and it is not a gap that went entirely unnoticed at the time, though the cultural and commercial machinery of the era had a significant investment in keeping it narrow. Seaming. Understanding that gap requires looking at several things simultaneously: the actual physical labour the kitchen demanded, the psychological weight of the standards it was expected to meet, the economic structures that shaped what was available and affordable, and the specific ways in which the advertising and home economics industries of the period collaborated, not always consciously, to present a version of domestic life that was aspirational to the point of being instructional about things it was actually impossible to achieve. Begin with the labour. The labour was substantial. A full accounting of what it took to run a household in 1955 for a family of 4 in a suburban house with a small yard would begin before breakfast and end, on most days, sometime in the late evening. Meals were cooked from relative scratch. The convenience food revolution was underway but had not yet fully arrived, and even where it had arrived, the social expectation of the period required that convenience foods be disguised or supplemented, because a meal that was too obviously from a can or a box reflected something about the woman who served it that she did not want reflected. The cooking itself was only part of the labour. There was also the shopping, the planning, the budgeting, the management of what was in the refrigerator and what was about to turn and what could be turned into something else before it did. There was the cleaning that followed every cooking session, not just the dishes but the stove and the counters and the floor, because a kitchen that was cooked in seriously got seriously dirty in the ways that only people who cook seriously understand. Laundry was a day's work, not an incidental task. Before automatic washing machines became common in the 1950s, and for years after they arrived but before they became universal, laundry involved physical work that required standing over a machine or a tub for hours, managing water temperatures and cycles and the specific requirements of different fabrics, then wringing and hanging and eventually ironing, because almost everything that could be ironed was expected to be ironed. White shirts, dress clothes, blouses, even sheets in households where that standard was maintained, which was more households than the retrospective imagination tends to account for. The ironing alone, for a family of 4 with a husband in a professional job, could take 2 or 3 hours on a single day. Childcare was ongoing, continuous, and substantially unshared in the period under discussion. The father of the 1950s household was expected to be financially providing for the family, a role that was honoured and that carried genuine weight. He was not, as a cultural expectation, expected to share meaningfully in the day-to-day physical management of children. There were exceptions, of course there were exceptions, but the exceptions were individual, not structural, and the structure assumed a default in which the mother managed. Getting children ready for school, monitoring homework, managing illness, coordinating social lives, navigating the emotional terrain of children at different ages simultaneously, this was women's work in a very literal sense, meaning it was work that women did, that it required real skill and real effort and real intelligence, and that it was categorized as something other than work in the cultural accounting of the period. The advertising industry of the post-war years had a complex relationship with this labour. On one hand, advertising for household products clearly required acknowledging that households needed to be kept, which required work. On the other hand, the work had to be presented in a way that made it seem both manageable and voluntary, because the alternative was to acknowledge a constraint that the advertising industry had no interest in naming, and that its customers had complicated feelings about naming themselves. The solution was a particular kind of visual and verbal language in which work was present but its weight was not. Women in advertisements are doing things. They're cooking, cleaning, organising, shopping. But they are doing these things with expressions of concentrated pleasure, of quiet satisfaction, of the specific joy of someone performing a chosen activity, rather than the specific exhaustion of someone managing an obligation that will not resolve itself no matter how many mornings they wake up and begin it again. The Frigidaire refrigerator advertisement shows a woman opening her beautiful new refrigerator with the expression of someone discovering a pleasant surprise. She's not thinking about what it cost, in money or in time or in the ongoing daily attention that tracking the contents of a refrigerator requires. The advertisement is not interested in that. The advertisement is interested in the refrigerator and in the idea that the refrigerator, properly owned, resolves the domestic situation into something beautiful and manageable, which it did in certain respects. The refrigerator was genuinely useful. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The automatic washing machine was genuinely useful. The new appliances of the post-war kitchen made things easier in real, measurable ways. But easier and easy are not the same thing, and the distance between them was substantial, and that distance did not appear in any advertisement. The home economics profession, which trained women in the management of domestic life, and had enormous influence over the educational curriculum that girls received in the mid-20th century, occupied an interesting position in this landscape. Home economics as a field was genuinely rigorous. It involved nutrition science, household chemistry, budgeting, fabric care, child development, food preparation techniques that were based on real understanding of cooking processes. The women who trained in it and who taught it were, in many cases, professionals who had made a serious intellectual commitment to a domain of knowledge that was not taken seriously by most of the men around them. And the instruction they gave was useful, practically useful in a way that the women who received it remembered decades later. But home economics also participated in the construction of an image of domestic life that was aspirational in ways that were not entirely honest about the cost of the aspiration. The textbooks that showed the ideally organised kitchen, with every item in its proper place and the weekly schedule charted clearly on the wall, and the meal plan worked out in advance, were not misrepresenting any individual element of what good household management looked like. They were misrepresenting the cumulative weight of maintaining all of those elements simultaneously across the weeks and months and years of a domestic life, with no institutional support, no paid assistance in most cases, no relief structure, no designated time off. Women who grew up in the post-war period and who went on to think and write about what it was like to be inside those kitchens have described something that the contemporary discourse struggled to name precisely. The exhaustion was real, but it was not the exhaustion of physical labour alone. It was the exhaustion of the total system, the constant management, the planning and the tracking and the anticipating and the adjusting, the work that never produced a finished state because the kitchen would be dirty again by morning, and the children would be hungry again at 6, and the shirts would need ironing again next Tuesday. There is a particular quality to labour that does not have an endpoint, that is defined structurally as ongoing maintenance rather than as progress toward completion, and that quality is genuinely hard to sustain across years without a cultural acknowledgement that what is being sustained is something real and demanding and worth naming. The cultural acknowledgement did not come easily or quickly. It came slowly through several channels simultaneously. Women writing about their experience of domestic life, carefully at first and then less carefully, as the decade moved toward the 60s and the terms of the conversation began to shift. Women talking to each other in kitchens and on front porches and in the aisles of grocery stores, in the particular way that people talk about things they are not supposed to say directly, through references and jokes, and the understated recognition that the other person understands exactly what you mean without requiring explicit statement. And eventually, in the early years of the 1960s, through direct engagement with the gap itself, the naming of what had been carefully left unnamed. Betty Friedan's book, published in 1963, gave a name to what she called the problem that has no name, the particular discontent of educated women living in post-war suburbs who found that the domestic life they had been offered as the appropriate form of a woman's ambition was not, in the experience of actually living it, what it had been advertised as being. The book was controversial, is still occasionally controversial, and makes arguments that historians have complicated and qualified in the decades since its publication. But its central observation, that there was a significant gap between the cultural image of the happy, fulfilled post-war housewife and the experience of a significant number of the women who were actually inside that life, was accurate in ways that the subsequent history has not seriously challenged. The kitchen of the 1950s and 60s was a real place where real labour was done by real women, with real skill and real intelligence and real exhaustion, and it was also a symbolic space in which an enormous amount of American cultural anxiety and aspiration was being staged. The gleaming appliances and the cheerful advertisements and the confident signature in red ink on the cookbook cover were not lies exactly. They were selections, careful emphasis on certain elements and careful omissions of others, and the gap between what was shown and what was lived is not a small or incidental thing. It is, in many ways, the central story of American domestic life in those decades, the story underneath the story, the version that did not appear in the magazines but that was being lived in kitchens across the country by women who had agreed, in most cases without explicit agreement, to run a system that was genuinely demanding, while the culture around them made a consistent effort to describe that system as something lighter, something more aspirational, something that could be managed with the right refrigerator and the right recipe and the right amount of cheerful competence. The women managed it. They managed it with real competence and real creativity and real investment, and many of them found genuine meaning and satisfaction inside the work itself, separate from whether the work was honoured in the ways it deserved, and they also, many of them, carried a tiredness that the photographs did not show, that the advertisements did not acknowledge, that the cookbooks did not address, because the tiredness was not a problem to be solved by a better appliance or a more efficient meal plan. It was the tiredness of the full system, the totality of the work, and the weight of carrying it largely alone, in a room that the culture had decorated beautifully and lit warmly, and filled with the smell of something baking and then left entirely to them. The beauty routines of the 1950s and 60s exist in a complicated space between the personal and the structural, between choices that women made for themselves and choices that the culture around them made on their behalf, choices encoded in the magazines they read and the advertisements they saw, and the social expectations of the neighbourhoods they lived in. Understanding these routines requires understanding both what they were, technically and practically, and what they meant, which is a more complicated question, and one for which there is not a single answer that covers every woman in every household, in every part of the country during this period. Begin with the basic morning routine, the one that the magazines showed you. The ideal American woman of 1955 woke up before her husband and applied a basic preparation, her moisturizer, her foundation, her lipstick, before he saw her, the implication being that appearing to him unadorned was a kind of failure of domestic maintenance, a visible reminder of the gap between the ideal and the actual. This was a real standard, not universally applied, but present enough in the culture that women were aware of it as a standard even if they chose not to follow it. Some women internalized it completely, some followed it on weekdays and relaxed it on weekends. Some found it exhausting from the beginning. Some found that it became automatic over years, part of the morning sequence of obligations that required no more conscious decision than putting on shoes. The cold cream question is worth sitting with, because cold cream in the American beauty routine of the post-war decades was not simply a cosmetic product, it was a ritual object, a thing that carried cultural meaning beyond its practical function of removing makeup and softening the skin. Pond's cold cream was for many American women the first beauty product they used independently, purchased from their own money or received as a gift at adolescence, and it was also the last product of the day, applied at night after the day's face had been removed, in the specific intimacy of the bedroom mirror, a kind of daily ceremony of preparation and release that bookended the performed version of the self with something more private. The cosmetics counter at the department store, which is distinct from the Woolworth's cosmetics counter in important ways that reflect the class architecture of post-war America, was a space of aspiration, and sometimes of genuine anxiety. Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein and the emerging American cosmetics companies of the era had invested heavily in creating an experience at the department store cosmetics counter that was designed to feel like access to expertise, access to the same products and techniques used by the women in the magazine advertisements, The women who worked these counters in the major department stores were trained in a particular kind of selling that was also a kind of advising, a presentation of themselves as knowledgeable about what you needed and able to provide it, an image of professional beauty consultation that was itself a form of theatre, very carefully designed theatre. Helena Rubinstein is a story that belongs in this conversation in its own right. Born in Krakow in 1872, she arrived in Australia in the first years of the 20th century, carrying a small amount of face cream developed by a Hungarian pharmacist, and she recognised in that cream a commercial possibility that the people around her had not seen. She began selling it, then making more, then expanding, then moving to London and eventually to New York, building over the course of a long and combative career an international cosmetics empire that was built on the precise understanding that beauty, in the modern industrial world, was a product and a practice and a form of self-presentation that women would invest in significantly if the investment was framed correctly. Rubinstein framed it as science and art simultaneously, which was a sophisticated position for the early 20th century. She hired chemists and worked with dermatologists and made claims about the scientific basis of her products that were sometimes well-founded and sometimes aspirational, but she also understood the aesthetic dimension of beauty in a way that many of her competitors did not. The relationship between how a woman looked and how she felt about herself, the way that the right product applied in the right way could be a genuine form of self-expression, rather than simply a form of disguise. She was not wrong about this, though she was also running a business, and the business's interests and the customer's interests were not always identical. The women who bought Helena Rubinstein products were buying something real alongside the cream, or the foundation, or the lipstick. They were buying access to an idea, the idea that they could make themselves look the way they wanted to look, that the gap between the face they had and the face they aspired to was bridgeable by skill and the right products, and that this bridging was available to them, not just to movie stars or to wealthy women, but to any woman who could afford the product and learn the technique. This was, in its way, a genuinely democratic proposition, even if the prices at the Rubinstein counter were not within every woman's reach, because the proposition itself, that beauty was learnable and achievable through practice, was more egalitarian than the aristocratic idea it replaced, the idea that you were simply born with the right face or you were not. The Home Permanent is a chapter in this story that deserves its own attention. The Tony Home Permanent, introduced in 1947, made it possible for a woman to give herself a permanent wave at home for a fraction of the cost of a professional salon permanent, and it transformed American hair care in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the current vantage point. Before the Home Permanent, a permanent wave required a trip to the salon, which required both money and time, and the result, a carefully controlled chemical process performed by a trained operator, was a professional service in the full sense. The Tony Home Permanent said that this service, or something close enough to it to matter, could be performed at home by the woman herself, with the assistance of a friend or a sister, using a kit that cost about $2 and came with everything needed: the solution, the rollers, the neutralizer, the instruction booklet. The instruction booklet was doing significant work. It assumed no prior knowledge of the chemical processes involved, while also providing enough information that the process could be followed successfully by someone with only the ordinary intelligence and manual dexterity that the average adult possessed. The result was not always identical to a salon permanent, and the Tony Company's advertising that famously asked which twin had the Tony made a comparison that was somewhat optimistic about the consistently achievable results of the home process. But the results were real, and the savings were real, and the experience of giving and receiving the permanent at home had its own value: a social ritual, an afternoon with a friend or a sister. The slightly alarming smell of the solution filling the bathroom, the careful rolling and the waiting and the checking, and eventually the unwrapping and the assessment, which might require a second opinion and sometimes did. The girdle is a chapter that the modern imagination finds hardest to inhabit, because it represents a degree of physical discomfort, undertaken voluntarily or quasi-voluntarily, that is genuinely difficult to reconstruct empathetically. But the girdle's presence in post-war American women's lives was nearly universal among women of a certain age and social position, and understanding it requires understanding the specific combination of fashion, social expectation, and internalized standard that made it seem, to most women who wore one, not as an unusual or extreme imposition, but simply as part of getting dressed. A girdle in 1955 was a foundation garment made of a combination of cotton and elastic, fitted from the waist to mid-thigh or below, designed to smooth and compress and shape the body underneath clothing. It was worn every day by most women over 25, with most outfits that required a smooth silhouette underneath them, which was most outfits, because the fashion of the period assumed a certain controlled smoothness of line that was easier to achieve with a foundation garment than without one, and the women's magazines were very clear that going without was not an option that a well-dressed woman would consider. The physical experience of wearing a girdle for 8 hours was specific. The compression was real. The restriction of movement was real. Sitting for long periods was uncomfortable in ways that had to be managed, and mostly were managed, because the discomfort was the familiar kind, the kind you have adapted to because it has been present for so long it has stopped registering as unusual. Women who wore girdles in this period have described the removal at the end of the day as a genuine physical relief, a kind of unwinding, the body reasserting its natural shape after hours of compression, and this daily contrast between the restricted self and the unrestricted self was itself part of the rhythmic structure of a day. The beauty routine taken in its full scope, the morning foundation and lipstick, the daytime girdle, the evening cold cream and pin curls, the weekly set at the salon or the home permanent every few months, the daily attention to the gap between the face you had and the face the culture expected, was substantial in its demands on time and money and physical comfort. And yet most of the women who maintained these routines did not describe them primarily as burdens, though they also did not describe them as pure pleasure. They described them, to the extent they described them at all, as simply what you did, which is the description of a practice so thoroughly embedded in the structure of daily life that it has stopped being a choice and become a given. This is both a description of accommodation and a description of something more complicated, the way in which the standards of a specific time and place become the furniture of a life, present and persistent and rarely examined as long as they serve their purpose. What the post-war beauty industry sold to women was not simply products. It sold a framework for understanding what self-presentation was and what it required, and what the results of doing it well would be, and that framework was built on assumptions about gender and desirability and social acceptability that were not often examined explicitly because they did not need to be. They were simply in the air, present in everything from the magazine page to the department store display to the conversation between neighbours. The framework was also, in certain ways, genuinely enabling, providing tools and techniques and the social permission to care about your own appearance in a culture that placed significant value on that appearance. Pleasure and constraint can exist in the same practice, often do, and the beauty routines of the post-war American woman are a particularly clear example of that coexistence. The home itself, the setting for all of this, the kitchen and the bathroom and the bedroom with the vanity table, carried its own set of standards that were just as aspirational and just as disconnected from universal reality as the beauty standards, and they were maintained by the same combination of genuine investment, social expectation, and the quiet pressure of living in a culture that had specific ideas about what a well-run home looked like, and communicated those ideas constantly and consistently through every available channel. The magazine article about kitchen organisation, and the advertisement for the new Hoover vacuum, and the neighbours' comments about the garden, and the mother-in-law's opinions about the bedroom curtains, were all participating in the same project, the construction and maintenance of a standard that was designed to be aspirational, which meant it was designed to be always slightly beyond what you had actually achieved, which meant it required constant effort, which meant it was never actually done. This is the thing the photographs could not show. Not the mess that came before the clean counter in the picture, though that mess was real. Not the tiredness of the woman behind the cheerful expression, though that tiredness was real. The thing the photographs could not show was the never-doneness, the structural impossibility of completion, the way in which the standard was built so that it was always just ahead of where you were, requiring one more thing, one more improvement, one more application of effort that would bring you to the version of domestic life the magazine was describing. Photographs can only show a moment. The never-doneness is a property of time, of the way that Monday always follows Sunday, that the dishes washed Tuesday are dirty again by Thursday, that the garden weeded in May needs weeding again in June, that the standard does not hold still long enough to be achieved and then set aside. It simply continues, generating its own succession of requirements, and the women who managed it year after year in kitchen after kitchen, in neighbourhood after neighbourhood, did so with a competence and a persistence that deserved far more acknowledgement than it received. There is a particular quality of light in the mid-century American kitchen in the late afternoon that belongs to no other room in the house. It comes in at an angle, through the window over the sink, and it does something specific to the surfaces of the kitchen, catching the enamel of the stove and the chrome of the percolator and the worn formica of the countertop in a way that is neither morning light nor evening light, but something distinctly of the hours between, a light that seems to understand it is presiding over the end of the productive part of the day, when the kitchen has already been worked hard and is about to be worked again for the dinner hour and the hour of cleaning that follows it. In this light, the kitchen looks different than it does in the photographs. In the photographs, the kitchen is static, composed, its surfaces arranged for the camera's particular kind of attention. In the afternoon light of a real Tuesday, the kitchen shows what the day has done to it. The dish towel hung over the oven handle is not perfectly positioned. There are a few crumbs near the toaster that the morning wipe down missed. The percolator has a faint ring of dried coffee near the base that you will address when you clean the stove tonight. None of this is failure. All of it is the evidence of a morning that was lived in rather than photographed, and the distinction matters. The woman standing at the sink in this afternoon light, filling the pot that will go on for the pasta, is not thinking about what the kitchen looks like. She's thinking about whether the pasta water needs to go on now, or whether 15 minutes is enough time, whether the salad can be made while the water heats, or whether the timing requires something different, whether there is enough butter, or whether she needs to check whether the evening is going to require the particular management that evenings sometimes require when the homework is difficult or the children have had a long day, or her husband comes home with the specific kind of tiredness that translates into a quieter evening than planned. She's thinking about all of this and none of it in the diffuse ambient way that managing a household requires, the continuous background processing that does not interrupt conscious thought, but does not entirely stop running either. The salad in a 1963 American household is not the salad of later decades, the mixed greens and the goat cheese and the balsamic reduction. It is iceberg lettuce, torn into pieces with whatever is available, tomato wedges, cucumber slices, perhaps some radishes from the garden if it is the right time of year, dressed at the table from the bottles on the Lazy Susan that sits in the centre of every family dinner table of this era. Italian or French or Thousand Island, purchased at the A&P and used until the bottle is empty, which takes several weeks, during which time the preference of each family member is established and becomes another small piece of the domestic knowledge that the cook maintains, the fact that your husband uses Italian and the oldest uses French and the middle child uses nothing and the youngest uses whatever makes the salad look the most interesting, which currently is Thousand Island because it is the most colourful. The kitchen timer is an object worth noticing. In 1963, the kitchen timer is either built into the stove, a dial that you turn and that rings when it reaches 0, or it is a standalone timer, a small metal or plastic device that works on a spring mechanism, wound by twisting the dial to the desired number of minutes and released by pushing a button, ticking audibly until the bell rings. The audible tick of the kitchen timer is one of the ambient sounds of the mid-century kitchen, present in the background of the cooking hour in the same way that the percolator's gurgle is present in the morning. These mechanical sounds, the tick of the timer and the percolator's push and the refrigerator's hum, are the soundtrack of the kitchen, and they are recorded in the bodies of the people who grew up inside them in a way that is not quite memory, but is something more physical than that, a kind of recognition that operates below the level of thought, so that the sound of a mechanical timer ticking on a YouTube cooking video in the present decade can locate someone, involuntarily and precisely in a kitchen that no longer exists. The supermarket of the early 1960s was still in its relative infancy as a concept, but it was already organising the way American households thought about food in ways that were fundamentally different from the ways food had been organised before. Before the supermarket, food shopping was often multiple separate trips: the butcher for meat, the produce stand for vegetables, the bakery for bread, the dairy for milk and eggs, each requiring a separate transaction in a separate location with a separate person who knew your name and your regular order, and who could sometimes be prevailed upon to hold something for you until you got there on Thursday. The supermarket consolidated all of this into a single trip, which was efficient and also changed something about the relationship between the shopper and the food and the people who sold it. The butcher who knew your name knew something about your household, your preferences, your budget, your habits, information that shaped the service you received in ways that were sometimes genuinely helpful and sometimes gently paternalistic. The supermarket checkout did not know your name, it knew your total. The transition had benefits that were real. Time was one of them. The single weekly shopping trip that the supermarket made possible freed time that had previously been spent making multiple separate trips, and that freed time could be used for other things, other tasks in the endless rotation of household management. The variety was another benefit. The range of products available in a mid-century supermarket dwarfed what any individual specialty store could offer, and the sheer availability of variety changed what was possible to cook, expanding the domestic repertoire in ways that were genuine expansions. But something was also lost. The specific relationship of regular patronage, the accumulated knowledge of the shopkeeper, the small social interactions of the separate stops that were, for some women, among the few regular social interactions outside the home that their daily structure reliably provided. This is not a sentimental observation. It is simply an accurate one, that gains and losses tend to come together, and the gains of the supermarket were real but didn't come without anything being given up. The PTA was, for many women of the post-war suburban decades, one of the primary civic institutions of their daily lives. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The place where their organisational capacities found a formal outlet, where the skills of managing and coordinating and planning and executing that their household lives required could be applied to a project that existed outside the household and that had a certain legibility as public contribution. The PTA ran bake sales and organised school events and advocated for resources and maintained a connection between the school and the community of families that the school served, and the women who did this work did it with the same competence and the same invisibility that characterised their domestic labour, their contribution accepted and essential and rarely named as such. The bake sale contribution in particular occupied an interesting position in this economy. A woman who brought excellent brownies to the school bake sale was contributing something that required skill and time and attention, and the knowledge of what her particular oven did to chocolate at 350 degrees. The brownies were excellent because she was a good baker, which she was because she had baked a great many batches of brownies over the years and had learned through the specific iterative process of trial and adjustment what produced the result she wanted. The brownies would sell quickly, and the sale would raise money for the school's new gym equipment, and the connection between the quality of the brownies and the quality of the sale and the eventual benefit to the children's physical education would be real and traceable in principle, though no one would trace it in practice because the brownies would simply be the brownies, as they always were, made by the same people who always made them, in kitchens that the other parents would never see. There is something worth sitting with at the end of all of this, about what it meant to do this work well, not what it meant to the culture, which had its own complicated accounting, not what it meant to the economists or the sociologists or the historians who would examine it later, what it meant to the woman herself, the one at the counter at 6:45, the one at the ironing board at 9, the one planning the menu on Wednesday morning, the one making the stock on a Friday afternoon while the house is quiet. It meant mastery of a specific and particular kind, mastery of the knowledge of a household, its systems and rhythms and specific requirements, mastery of the tools and the techniques and the timing, mastery of the social navigation that the household required, both inside and outside its walls, mastery of the art of maintaining a standard that never held still, that kept requiring new application of the same attention, so that the skill was not in doing the thing once but in doing it continuously, across years, without losing either the competence or the willingness. This kind of mastery was not celebrated. It did not produce the public acknowledgements that other kinds of mastery produced. It was not the subject of awards or promotions or professional recognition of any kind. It was acknowledged, when it was acknowledged at all, in the language of domesticity, the well-run home, the good cook, the capable household manager, terms that carried genuine meaning, but that existed in a register that did not quite reach the level of the cultural recognition that other forms of expertise received. This is a historical fact. It is not the whole story. The whole story includes the genuine satisfaction that the mastery itself could produce, the pleasure of the thing done well, the specific pleasure of a meal that came out right, a house that ran smoothly, a Tuesday that contained everything it needed to contain and was managed without anyone noticing the management. The satisfaction of invisible competence is a real satisfaction, even when it is also a constraint. The two things can be true at the same time. They were for many women in many kitchens true at exactly the same time, lived together in the same body, on the same Tuesday morning, at the same ironing board, in the same smell of coffee and ironed cotton, and the specific quality of a kitchen that has been worked hard and is about to be worked again. And so we find ourselves at the end of tonight's journey, which began in a kitchen before sunrise and ends, somehow, in the same place, with the same questions that the morning always raises and the same quiet recognition that some things do not change as much as the decades would suggest. The four worlds we visited tonight were very different on their surfaces. A Tuesday morning in 1963, with its eggs and its ironing and its particular arithmetic of children and schedules and the mental list that never quite clears. The story of Betty Crocker, that magnificent, useful, genuinely helpful fiction built from the real labour of real women whose names disappeared into a signature that was not theirs. The cosmetics counter at Woolworths and the sophisticated, underappreciated skill of standing in one place for 8 hours and reading what another person actually needs as distinct from what she says she wants. And the gap in the photographs, the tiredness that the gleaming post-war kitchen did not show and was not designed to show, and the women who carried it anyway every morning without being asked whether they wanted to. What connects these four things underneath the surface differences is something very simple. People doing real work in real circumstances with the specific intelligence and the specific exhaustion that real work in real circumstances always requires. The woman at the ironing board on a Tuesday morning in 1963 was not performing domesticity. She was managing a complex household system with the competence of someone who had invested years in learning it, and the fact that this competence was invisible in the culture around her does not mean it was invisible in the kitchen where she used it. The home economists who answered letters as Betty Crocker were not pretending to be experts. They were experts, doing genuinely useful work in a field that required real knowledge under a name that was not theirs, for an audience that needed what they knew. The salesgirl at the cosmetics counter was not simply selling lipstick. She was practicing a form of social intelligence day after day that is difficult to learn and genuinely valuable, and if the paycheck did not say so, and if the job title did not say so, it was nonetheless true. What the photographs of that era chose to show us was the best version of these lives, the clean counter, the smiling face, the sense that the domestic world was a happy, manageable place that any woman could inhabit cheerfully and successfully. What the photographs chose not to show us was the weight of the system, the accumulation of days, the specific and unacknowledged expertise required to keep it all running. And the distance between those two images is not simply a historical curiosity. It is a reminder about what happens when we look at any version of a life from the outside without accounting for what the inside actually contains. Tonight, somewhere, there is probably a kitchen that smells of coffee and something baking. Someone is in it, has been in it for hours, or will be in it soon, doing the work that keeps a household going, the invisible, ongoing, never quite finished work that has always been at the centre of domestic life, in every decade, in every version of the house that the culture has built around it. That work does not always get photographed, it does not always get named, but it is real, and the people doing it are doing something that requires real skill and real attention and real endurance, and they always have been. Take that thought with you into the quiet. Let the sound of a percolator settle somewhere in the back of your mind. Let the smell of ironed cotton, warm and clean, be the last thing you carry into sleep. And rest now in the knowledge that the ordinary, when you look at it closely enough, turns out to be anything but. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.